All yours, Ed.
Thank you very much, Ernie. Appreciate it. And last segment in this series, we started with the origins of the narrow gauge railways in North Wales. And today we're going to bring it across the Atlantic and discuss the New England states. So let's get ready. Regardless of gauge, the modeling of narrow gauge railways is a very popular subject in the model railroading fraternity. Actually, I should say regardless of scale, my bad. There are even regularly scheduled meetings for those interested. Without the prototype, though, there would be no modeling. Part one of this series, we looked at the origins of the narrow gauge in North Wales. We're going to review that for a few pictures. In tonight's segment, this afternoon segment, we will look at the earliest applications of narrow gauge in the United States, which took place in 3 of the New England states, and take it forward through the entire milieu. So tonight's subject, 2 feet, this afternoon's subject, 2 feet in the Pine Tree State, the main narrow gauge in the 21st century, presented by Edward M. Koehler Jr. And that's my friend the moose at the Maine Wildlife Park. Just as a quick review to over part one, the story begins across the Atlantic Ocean in North Wales. In the late 1820s, slate quarry owners in the area around Bala-Festiniog needed a way to transport their products from the quarries to a port. A project to build a railway was thus born. During 1830, the Festiniog Railway hired Mr. James Spooner to design their railroad in the most economic way possible. Mr. Spooner allegedly measured the width of the gait of a horse, determining it was 1 foot 11.5 inches wide. And that's how he allegedly chose his gauge. Peter Johnson, who I've had conversations with, is a very eminent English narrow gauge rail fan, and he suggested that the 1 foot and 11.5 inch gauges was actually the gauge used at one of the quarries that the Festiniog would serve. Whatever, we'll never know the real story. Anyway, Mr. Spooner designed a railway that transported loaded slate with gravity power, which was all downhill. Empties would be moved upgrade by horses. The horse-drawn Festiniog Railway opened on April 20th, 1836, using a nominal 2-foot gauge. And the narrow gauge Festiniog inaugurated the use of steam locomotives on October 16th, 1863. They had been told, or Mr. Spooner had been told, that your railroad tracks are too narrow to put real live steam locomotives on. The diminutive steam locomotives caught the attention of railroad promoters and design engineers worldwide. Among them were General William J. Palmer, who would incorporate the Denver and Rio Grande on October 27th, 1870. And then there's the subject of this afternoon's presentation, George Mansfield. And just to review, here's the Festiniog Railway's Princess at the Falls circa 1870. And heavily rebuilt, the Princess is still with us. As are, I think, the second and third car in the fourth car rather in this train. The third car has been recreated. Here's George Mansfield. His first endeavor was a gravity-powered demonstration line in New Hampshire that became known as the Sumner Heights and Hazelwood Railroad. Mansfield was joined by Charles A. Ranlett in the incorporation of the Billerica and Bedford Railroad on May 10, 1876. Mr. Ranlett owned a railcar building firm in New Hampshire. Billerica and Bedford Railroad, incorporated in Massachusetts on May 10, 1876, linked the Bedford station of the Middlesex Central Railroad with the North Billerica station of the Boston, Lowell, and Nashua Railroad. This line was 8.63 miles long. The line opened on January 28, 1877, and went into bankruptcy on January 30th, 1878. Wow, it made it 2 whole months. Assets were sold at auction on June 6, 1878. And the B&B's locomotive aerial in service circa 1878. Its mate on the line was the Puck. And the boiler from the aerial or the Puck, which is now on display up in Maine. We'll visit Phillips, Maine a little bit later. And the Bedford Engine House, which was later turned into a freight house and is today a local museum in Bedford, Massachusetts. To the right, there's a Boston and Maine RDC car on display. And here's the Bedford Engine House side view. This little lower section here in the back has public restrooms, and that's an add-on to the original structure. The Middlesex Central's Bedford Passenger Station still stands. It's a beauty parlor, and it's at right angles to what was the original main line of the Middlesex Central, which has been abandoned. It's actually almost along the track bed of the Billerica in Bedford. The Loomis Street entrance in Bedford to the narrow gauge trail. And the monument to the narrow gauge line, and a short section of track at Loomis Street. And a quarry dump wagon frame near Loomis Street, and it's chained to the rails because if it weren't, you all know what would be happening with it regularly. Side of the B&B Spring Street stop. Most of the right-of-way is still intact, although the north end near Billerica is not. And here's the Boston, Lowell, and Nashua Railroad's North Billerica Station. It's actually, if you look carefully, it was once a beautiful building. It's now become rather utilitarian, but it's still in use, well taken care of, and the T comes by there, the purple T comes by there several times a day in each direction. George Mansfield and the assets of the Bedford and Billerica Railroad headed north to Farmington, Maine. You know, you go into bankruptcy, you're sure to skulk out of town. And we're going to visit now with somebody else for a moment, the S.D. Warren and Company. A paper mill was established in Westbrook, Maine during 1854. This is on the outskirts of Portland. 2-foot gauge horse-drawn line was built between the woodlot and the mill circa 1860. Steam locomotives were utilized between 1895 and 1948. This was the first 2-foot gauge line in the United States using locomotives. And here's the woodlot at the S.D. Warren paper mill. And one of the S.D. Warren steam locomotives post 1926 because it appears to now be oil fired and it has a metal cab. And here's some of the 1881 worker housing from the S.D. Warren Company in Maine. By the way, those houses are all duplexes. We'll get back to the S.D. Warren Company in the Portland, Maine area later in this presentation. Sandy River Railroad. Now we're beginning to come up with some familiar names. Incorporated on March 31st, 1879, George E. Mansfield was named the line's first superintendent. Construction between Farmington and Phillips began on June 5th, 1879, completed to Strong on October 27th, 1879, to Phillips on December 30th, 1879. It's amazing how in the Victorian age, projects got completed so fast. And here's Sandy River Railroad number 5. Now, 1 and 2 were the Ariel and Puck, which came from the B&B. On March 15th, 1880, George E. Mansfield resigned his position with the Sandy River Railroad. But we'll run into him later. Franklin and Megantic Railroad. This company was incorporated on July 1st, 1883. This line connected with the Sandy River at Strong and built to Kingfield, a distance of 15 miles. Construction was completed on December 10th, 1884. The line opened in spring 1885. And here's for Franklin and Megantic Railroad number 1 with a couple of the boys out there. Phillips and Rangeley Railroad was incorporated on April 17th, 1889 by a group of Massachusetts businessmen who owned a large tract of timber in Franklin County, Maine. The railroad was to run from Phillips, Maine to Rangeley, Maine. The line was open throughout on July 1st, 1891. Phillips and Rangeley 3 along the line. That little canister looking thing above the cab roof is a vacuum brake ejector. They did not use air brakes on the Phillips and Rangeley. They had continuous vacuum brakes, sort of English style. Kingfield and Dead River Railroad. Now, if this isn't a name that looks like it should be on a model railroad, I don't know what is. Incorporated on June 19th, 1893 by the officers of the Franklin and Megantic Railroad. Opened for service on August 1st, 1894 between Kingfield and Carabasset. Went into bankruptcy in early 1898 and sold at auction to the F&M, Franklin and Megantic, on August 2nd, 1898. Extended to Bigelow on August 23rd, 1900. Madrid Railway. The Maine Railroad Commission gave permission to the Madrid Railway, a subsidiary of the Phillips and Rangeley, on April 29, 1902, to build a 6-mile logging branch. A branch off the Madrid reached Holman's Mills on October 27, 1903, and Gray's Farm slightly thereafter. Entered receivership on January 30th, 1905. Eustis Railroad. The Eustis Railroad was chartered by the Phillips and Rangeley on April 29, 1903 to build a branch line. The Eustis Railroad was leased by the owning Phillips and Rangeley Railroad on April 4th, 1904. Went into receivership on January 30th, 1905. In August 1911, the Eustis Railroad was shut down by the bondholders. And here's Eustis Railroad number 8's builder's photo. No, they didn't have 8 locomotives, but their locomotive roster was numbered within the Phillips and Rangeley system. So the Eustis Railroad had 2 locomotives, number 7 and number 8. Here's the name that most of us are familiar with. Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad. Created by a merger of the Sandy River Railroad, the Franklin and Megantic Railway, and the Kingsfield and Dead River Railroad on January 30th, 1908. On July 1st, 1908, the Phillips and Rangeley Railroad and the Madrid Railroad were purchased. The Eustis Railroad was leased. The Eustis Railroad was purchased on August 24th, 1911. Whew! Let's see if we can take a look at the map and understand all this. This is an undated map of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad. The Maine Central connected at Farmington. We have the, let's see if I get this right. The original Sandy River coming north out of Farmington. From Strong, this is the Phillips and Rangeley going all the way over to Rangeley. We have the Madrid line, the Madrid Railroad over here. And if memory serves me correct, out of Eustis Junction, you have the Eustis Railroad. And we got the Kingfield and Dead River going from Kingfield up to Bigelow. But that isn't the only narrow gauge, 2-foot narrow gauge railroad in Maine. But I'm getting ahead of myself because on August 31st, 1911, the Maine Central Railroad, owner of the majority of the stock of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad, took over the daily management of the 2-foot gauge railroad. And here's Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 9 and a Baldwin's builder's photo. You know, they large line, they merged, and they needed more and bigger power. Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 8 on a passenger train. Notice there's two baggage cars and a coach. Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 24th, the Sandy River Railroad's Phillips Roundhouse. They finally broke out of the Forneys that they were buying a lot, that they had been buying continually, and they bought, well, first a 260 and then a series of 262s, and they converted the earlier 260 into a 262. A rail fan bought one of these at the abandonment time, but by refusing to move it off the property, it was lost to the scrappers. And Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Rail Bus number 4 in Phillips with its luggage trailer. The decline of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. On July 1st, 1923, the line went into receivership, ending Maine Central involvement. During the later 1920s, winter service was withdrawn between Phillips and Rangeley. Service over the entire line was suspended from July 8th, 1932 until April 17th, 1933, when operations were limited to between Farmington and Carrabassett. All service was terminated on June 30th, 1935. Wesley Spear. Now, by the way, I should have brought this to attention. These yellow screens with the green lettering, these are folks I'm going to say are the heroes of the 2-foot narrow gauge. We've already said this is our second one for this. During 1970, a gentleman named Wesley Spear became involved with the Phillips Historical Society to preserve the memory of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lake. A machinist, he built a gas mechanical locomotive resembling Monson Railway number 4. He led the acquisition of the Ambleside Farm, which included the former Phillips and Rangeley Phillips Roundhouse site. By the way, the Phillips Historical Society has a very nice museum in Phillips that has some wonderful model railroading in it. It's not open a lot, check their website, and if you can be there when it's open, make a point to stop by. The Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad Park. The remains of the former Phillips and Rangeley Stone Fort Roundhouse in Phillips were used as a base to recreate that building between 1996 and 2001. Many Sandy River and Rangeley Lake buildings and pieces of rolling stock were moved to the Phillips site on the former Ambleside farm. Circa 1972, the museum began to entertain visitors. And here's the former Monson number 3 in Phillips. This is leased from the Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad Museum, this locomotive. And here's Wesley Spear's number 4. Take a close look at it. It was designed to resemble Monson number 4, which is a dead ringer for Monson number 3. And here's a legitimate Monson number 3. All in all, I think Wesley did a good job. By the way, that's a Ford Mustang that he started with to create this locomotive. Number 11, a diesel mechanical. Phillips and Rangeley, coach number 4. This is an original. Sandy River Railroad coach 6, another original. As if Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 32. The original 32 was an excursion car on the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. Long gone. The car was recreated at Edaville and later passed to the Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad Museum. As if Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 33. This represents Edaville recreating an open excursion car, realizing they needed something that was a little better enclosed for the winter weather because they operated year-round, so they enclosed the open excursion car. If you look to the right, you'll see the 32. You can get an idea of the difference between the two. Here's Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 59. This is an original, an insulated cream car. Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 121. It looks like a boxcar, but it's designed for grain loading. Hence the inspection door at one end, which would also be found on lumber cars designed to carry lumber. And the 155, it's just a plain Jane boxcar. Recreated by the Sandy River folks is Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 271. It's a pulpwood car recreation. The trucks might be original, but everything else is new. Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes 503, an ex F&M 5, a four-wheel flanger car. And Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Caboose 556. It's original. The 559 is not. This was built by the good folks up in Phillips. And here's Monson number 3 approaching the Farm Road crossing. They have a short, I think it's about 3/4 of a mile long run that takes you from a station on the restored relocated station, takes you down to the Phillips Roundhouse site. And number 3 on the turntable. That's the engineer standing next to the cab and the fireman, who's a woman, powering the Armstrong turntable. And here's number 3 outbound at the Farm Road crossing with a mixed freight. Let's take a tour of the remains of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. Many of the buildings have been relocated. We'll put them back where they belong in this tour. Easy to do when you're using photographs and PowerPoint. Here's the relocated joint Main Central, Sandy River and Rangeley Lake Station in Farmington. It's about 100 yards from where it used to be, and at a right angle. And the Main Central's former Farmington Freight House. The section in the far distance past the bay window has been added on. You can see where the roofing sort of changes. And the bay window wasn't there in the days when it was a railroad facility. Here's Maplewood Station. We're on the road to Phillips. And approaching Phillips, we have the Phillips Section House. Now, this building was later renovated to serve as a residence for the caretaker at the Sandy River Railroad Park. And the former machine shop in Phillips. The roundhouse was at the left. That was a victim of fire a number of years ago. And here's the Phillips Station. And the Phillips Freight House. Phillips Freight House has been relocated. The Phillips Tool Shed. Let's go back to Strong, which we passed through earlier, and follow the former Franklin and Megantic and the Kingfield and Dead River. Not the former Strong Depot. In the 1970s, some people bought property right next to the former right-of-way. And they built a building from basically Main Central Railroad station plans. They completed the outside of the building, never completed the interior, walked away. So everyone comes into Strong, looks at it and says, "Ooh, the railroad station." But the answer is no, it isn't. The station was actually at a right angle to this building and next to the road that comes into Strong. And an original railroad building that still exists in Strong is the New England Creamery. And you notice the door in the center is at a raised level. That was because that was the door where they loaded the boxcars. Or the cream cars, as they were known up in New England, that part of New England. Here's a F&M's Hillside Station flag stop. It was moved, used as a farm building, and they've started restoration. The first job part of it was narrowing the door into the building. The former F&M Franklin and McGantic Salem Depot. It's a nice little house. And there's a garage. They have the former Salem maintenance shed. And in case you're unsure about the building, the owners have put up this little sign, Salem Depot. The Kingfield car shed at the end of the line was the left-hand bay with a different roof line of this structure. The building ended up being in possession of a Chrysler Plymouth dealer. The Chrysler Plymouth, at this point in time, the Chrysler Plymouth dealer had gone out of business, and I'm not sure what was going to happen with this building. I haven't checked on it lately, but this was the car shed, or part of it was the car shed. And end of the line, the Kingfield and Dead Rivers Bigelow Station. The building at the two-story section in the back was a recent addition. They tore down an old Sandy River and Rangeley Lake maintenance of way shed that originally stood there. But you can see the owners know what they got, because there's a there's a 2-foot gauge wheel and axle set, and probably about 3 foot of 2-foot gauge track. We'll now return to Phillips and follow the former Phillips and Rangeley. Another view of the other side of the Phillips station. Side of the Phillips and Rangeley's Phillips North Yard. Excuse me, I sometimes press things I shouldn't. So this is the Phillips North Yard. As a yard, it was basically just 3 long parallel tracks. And you can sort of see where they were. The red barn wasn't there at the time. Buildings on the left, despite them having a railroady look to them, are actually new. But one of the buildings that was there is the Phillips section car house. That's been moved down into a little bit further south. Looking north across the side of the covered bridge in Phillips. And if you look carefully in the bottom right of the picture where the mouse is going around, these stones are actually bridge piers. There was a pier in the middle, and this was a covered bridge that carried the railroad. And here's the Phillips, the original Phillips Museum building, which was sort of a cobbled together from, I'm not sure what. But it was, it doesn't have any connection to the historic narrow gauge, but it certainly is connected to the restoration effort. And here's the reconstructed stone fort roundhouse, which uses cinder blocks versus stones on the original. It's a rather impressive structure, I might add. And they do their restoration and they maintain their locomotives in this facility. Here's the 1992-1996 built portion of the roundhouse. And the 2001 built portion of the roundhouse. And the reinstated Sandy River and Rangeley Lake track beckons. Let's take a ride from north of the stone fort. The Wesley Spear reveals its Mustang heritage. When that starts to move, you know you can hear it's not a steam locomotive. The inviting interior of Sandy River Railroad coach number 6. The chairs are not the original, or based on the original. Basically, Wesley Spear got a good deal on Volkswagen van seats. So he bought a bunch of them, put red slip covers over them, And they are quite comfortable, I might add, but not prototypical. The car, though, itself is otherwise magnificently restored. And here's the caboose, interior of Caboose 559, with the wrecking tools that were traditionally carried by the Sandy River and Rangeley Lake. Their right of way was sometimes a little bit less than what you would want. And here's the site of the Big Boulder Wreck. If anyone can't figure out why it was called the Big Boulder Wreck, raise your hand right now. We'll have a little discussion. This sign still protects a now gone Ambleside Farm Road. And Sanders, which is the park stop with the Wesley Spears #4 standing at it. And Reed's Hill Station, Sanders Station, Dead River. Now, Dead River is interesting. This house is now rented out for people who want to camp rustically. There's no running water. There is a outhouse off picture to the right. But to the left, off picture, and there's no remains of it, was once a 50 by 100-foot freight warehouse. This was the closest to the province of Quebec that the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes came, and a paved road that went across the north end of Maine was within 50 feet of it. So they did major transfer freight out of this facility. And Marble Station. The Marble Station is now a private home. It was built to resemble a hotel known as the Marbles, and it's right on Rangeley Lake. Building is beautiful. The setting is beautiful. Unfortunately, you can't get there by train anymore. And as I said, the main two footers were more than the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. Now, the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes was a 900-pound gorilla in the room. But we've got the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington over here. The Kennebec Central here, and all the way off to the left, we've got the Monson. And then the Bridgeton and Saco River, right in the, oh God, I've lost the Bridgeton and Saco River. Well, here's the Bridgeton and Saco River. Here's the Monson up here. I'm sorry, I confused the two. The Monson Railroad was chartered on November 1st, 1882 to connect Monson with the Bangor and Piscataquis Railroad, later the Bangor and Aroostook. The 6.16 mile line opened on October 22nd, 1883. The principal freight shipper was the Monson, Maine Slate Company, who acquired control of the railroad circa 1908. And here's Monson #3 at the Monson Station. On November 1st, 1938, passenger service was discontinued. What they basically did was they stopped coupling the combine to the end of every freight that went down to the junction. On July 12, 1943, the Monson, Maine Slate Company received permission to operate motor trucks for their slate shipments. The Monson Railroad was sold to the junkmen. The last two steam locomotives went to a Rochester, New York junkyard. And here's Monson Station, which still stands. There was a building to the right of it that was somewhat identical. That building no longer stands. And the engine house, which was then further down, that building is also gone. But across the street from the passenger station, you have the original 1908 General Office, which still stands as a house. And back of that house, there's the relocated engine house shed. This wasn't the engine house. This was the shed outside the engine house that they used to store supplies in. And fortuitively, it survived. The Bangor and Aroostook's Monson Junction station also survives, but it's in terrible shape. The Bangor and Aroostook was, if you came on the left-hand side, north and south, the Monson was on this side, east and west. They basically had a T junction, and because one was 2-foot gauge and one was standard gauge, nothing got interchanged. Everything got unloaded on a platform and then wheeled into a Bangor and Aroostook freight car. Boyd Brothers Lumber Company. God, Ed, you're all over the place. Operated a horse-powered 2-foot gauge woods line near Hebron Lake, 1912 to 1916. Boyd Brothers was logging a track under contract to the Maine Central Railroad. The finished lumber was used for railroad car building. Their 4 cars were sold to the Monson at the completion of the contract. What are the cut wood? The Maine Central used the lumber cut by Boyd Brothers to construct Sandy River and Wrangley Lake cabooses, 556 to 558, probably 27 feet long, 15-ton capacity boxcars, 121 to 145, and probably 33 feet long, 15-ton capacity flat cars, 401 to 425, which were all built in the Thompson shops located in Portland, Maine in the 1912 to 1913 era. Some of the Thompson Point shop buildings are still standing. If you know where to look for them, as you're going on Interstate 295 through Portland, you look to the left and you can see them. The lumber would have also been used for standard gauge equipment and repairs. Remember, in this era, 1912 to 1913, there were a lot of wood cars running around our railroad system. Kennebec Central Railroad. On September 12, 1889, the Kennebec Central Railroad was incorporated to connect Randolph with the National Soldiers' Home at Togus. The 2-foot gauge line was opened for service on July 23, 1890. Visitors to the home and coal for the home's heating plant were carried by this line. Now here's Kennebec Central Railroad number 2 at the Togus home. A volunteer narrow gauge trail in the town of Randolph. Town of Randolph has taken the former right-of-way and converted it into a walking path. The town of Togus has not done the same, so this is a walking path that just ends in the middle of nowhere. Kennebec Central had a car house where they kept their cars when they were not in service, their passenger cars, and that building was located right about here. And this was the main line here. The Togus Road declines. The Augusta and Togus Railroad and Interurban paralleled the line during 1901. The coal delivery contract was lost in the spring of 1929 to barges. The road shut down on June 29, 1929. By 1933, the last 2 surviving locomotives were sold to the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad. And that was basically the end of the Little Togus Railroad, because a few months later, a flood completely wiped out the south end of the line. And let's visit the big one on the WWNF. On February 14th, 1873, the Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad was chartered and took over the moribund Kennebec and Wiscasset. The first construction work did not take place until June 1894. Wiscasset to Weeks Mills was opened for public service on February 27th, 1895. Weeks Mills to Albion went into public service on November 4th, 1895. An extension from Albion to Burnham en route to Pittsfield was built and then abandoned due to the failure to obtain permission to cross the Maine Central on October 6, 1897. A subsidiary, the Franklin, Somerset, and Kennebec Railway, was formed to build another extension. This project also fails. The Wiscasset and Quebec went into receivership on July 1st, 1900. And here's Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad number 2. Again, a Forney. Enter the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad. The Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad was incorporated on February 5th, 1901. The new company took over the assets of the Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad, the Franklin, Somerset, and Kennebec Railroad, and the Wiscasset and Waterville Railroad on July 1st, 1901. The Franklin Construction Company was formed to build a line between a connection with the WW&F at Weeks Mills and Burnham. Trackage between Weeks Mills and Winslow went into revenue service in August 1902. Trackage between North Vassalboro and Winslow was removed during 1915. The WW&F Railroad went into receivership on October 7th, 1905. The WW&F Railway. On December 4th, 1906, the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad was put up for sale. The Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway took over the line on January 1st, 1907. During December 1930, a local lumberman named Frank W. Winter purchased the outstanding shares of the railway. Here's WW&F 7 being readied for service during the latter existence of the line. Frank Winter, I have a problem showing him as a hero of the narrow gauge, but he did a lot positive, and I'll talk about the negative in a few moments. He secured asset control of the WW&F after an auction on August 1st, 1932, operated the railway on a bare minimum basis to transport lumber from a track near Palermo, ceased railway operations due to a derailment at head tide on June 15th, 1933, transferred the right-of-way to a nonprofit organization, Winter Scientific, circa 1937. Okay, this is the good stuff. Frank Winter, the less than good stuff. During his lumbering operation, which really never got up to speed, he sailed 2 ships into the harbor into the harbor. They basically were in such bad shape they sank. And eventually, years later, the Coast Guard had to salvage them, tow them out, and have target practice to sink them out in the ocean. He also operated a restaurant. And the location of the restaurant is still a restaurant, but Frank is, long gone, and so is his restaurant. He didn't file tax returns. The Maine Department of Revenue came down to visit him and say, "Excuse me, sir, we don't have any reports of any revenue here." And his argument is, well, I'm a nonprofit organization. This isn't a restaurant. This is a school to teach young ladies the fine art of waitressing. Folks, I give you Frank W. Winter, an interesting character. And number 8 on the ground near head tide. I'm not sure who that is standing in front of the locomotive, but it was a typical rail fan visit New England in the 30s. Go get your picture taken with the railed locomotive. William Moneypenny, definitely a hero. Although he really didn't live long enough to see what good he did. He purchased WW&F Railway Locomotive 9, Boxcar 309, Flatcar 118, and a V-shaped dump car during 1937. This equipment was transported to the Ramsdell Farm in Connecticut and stored pending the construction of a rail line. That rail line never got constructed. The equipment was stored until coming to the attention of the WW&F Railroad Museum in Allen, Maine in the 1989 to 1995 period. In the meantime, Mr. Moneypenny passed, and his widow took over ownership. Harry E. Percival Jr. performed work for Moneypenny's widow at the Ramsdell Farm. During 1985, acquired the right-of-way of the WW&F owned by Winter Scientific. Yes, That 1937 transaction that Winters did to hide his property saved the railroad, the entire railroad. Harry Percival also acquired the Wiscasset and Quebec Corporation, which still existed. Someone was paying the annual registration fees. Percival established a property in Alna, Maine, where rail preservation could go forward. And here's Percival's house in Alna. Notice the shingles on the roof. To the right, the building under construction would eventually become a car barn. And the museum shop building at Alna. Excellent facility. They have built a number of pieces of rolling stock in this building. And it's the design is based on the WW&F shop that used to stand down by the harbor. Alna is a few miles outside of the harbor. Motor car 4 being turned in Alna. This is a recreation. WW&F 9, that's the sister to the number 8, which you saw derailed a few moments ago. WW&F 10, this was originally a locomotive on a sugar cane plantation down in Louisiana. It was purchased by Edaville, rebuilt to the 2-foot gauge, and never really got a lot of attention. Was leased out for a while, and it ended up in Alna. Nice little locomotive. It's currently undergoing a boiler rebuild. And WW&F number 52. Nice little Plymouth, 2-foot gauge Plymouth. Wiscasset and Quebec number 3. Yes, it has survived. It went through the Edaville treatment, but it's back to what its original glory. And as if WW&F Smoker 8, this is one of the closed coaches built by the good folks at Edaville. They got it up to Alna Center and said, it looked like old number 8, so they painted it as such. Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad and Museum 103. This is one of the open cars built at Edaville. Now, of course, calling it an open car may be a bit of a misnomer, because if one looks very carefully at the car, it has electric heaters underneath the benches. And on the sides, there are screw holes where at Edaville, they used to screw in plexiglass to close in the car. And they would add a door at the end. So the open car became a closed car for the Christmas season at Edaville. And the good folks at the WW&F, they've been very busy. They have recreated Dairy Car 65. They move it down to the harbor where it's on display, and then in the winter, they take it back up to Alna. WW&F 118, this is Moneypenny's flat car. It no longer carries the benches on top of it. And they recreated, there was enough hardware around. They recreated a flat car and numbered it 126. Boxcar 309 from the Ramsdale farm. Notice it has no reporting marks. None of the main narrow gauge equipment usually carried reporting marks, because there was never any interchange to speak of. Once you got into the era of reporting marks, everything stayed on their home line because there were no connections. The Franklin Construction Company was supposed to build a caboose for the WW&F. They never built it. But in the archives of the Portland Corporation, which was a major narrow gauge rail car construction company, they had the plans. The good folks at the WW&F got the plans, and they built Caboose 320. So this is not a recreation. It's not a recreation. It's, I guess you call it as what if it had been built? What would it have looked like? And the Alma Museum has built a large display building and car shed, as we saw it in earlier parts of the construction. Let's take a tour over the remains of the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington. A few of the buildings have been relocated and are recreated. We'll put them back where they belong during this tour. The main central Wiscasset handcar shed. East from the creamery site, the WWNF's Wiscasset trestle remains. That's this line of piles you see right here in the foreground. When the Main Eastern was running their excursions, this was basically this is a parking lot office. This is where their trains would originate in Wiscasset. And this is the deck at Wiscasset, where there's a couple of nice places to grab some food. And looking west at the Wiscasset trestle remains from Route 1. You got to take your life into your hands when you take this picture, because the traffic is unbelievable. And notice that the railroad actually went across one of the piers. Actually, it was two of the piers. There was another one out here. The railroad crossed the piers midway out. And site of the WWNF station and the main central crossing in Wiscasset. The WWNF came in this way, went across right at the curve, and the station was on a trestle that was built across the swamp you see here. And this big brick building, that's the sewer plant in Wiscasset. Looking north from Crossroad Alna, this is the south end of the trackage. It had been Harry Percival's dream to see a WWNF train on the Crossroad grade crossing. Unfortunately, that has not yet been achieved. They come right up to the grade crossing, but they don't cross it. This is the recreated Sheepscott Station building. Although the inside is a historical display, you don't buy your tickets there. And here's number 10 arriving at Alna. Number 9 at the Alna platform. And dumping the ashes after the run. You can see the glow underneath here. Number 10 in the train at Alna. The WWNF Sheepscott Station still survives at its original site. Well, actually, this is the second Sheepscott Station. This was originally a maintenance of way shed in Sheepscott, or in Alna Center, which WWNF called Sheepscott, in Alna rather. The Sheepscott Station, which was down at the crossing for Crossroads, burned. So the WWNF repaired it by just moving the station sign to this building. And here's watering the number 10 in Alna. Number 9 approaching Alna. And motor car 4 arriving at Alna. See, if you get there the right day, you can get a whole parade of equipment coming in. Here's the site of the cockeyed curve wreck. Again, you can see how there's a very gentle S-curve. The recreated Alna Center Station. I love going on photo charters because they recreate scenes. Like this one, the conductor and clerk conferring. Or loading freight at Alna. Here's dusk, number 9 at Alna Center. Midday, number 9 at Alna Center. Number 10 at the top of the mountain, which was for a while the end of their operating line. And here's number 9 backing onto a freight. Again, it's one of those photo charters. Notice everyone is in 1930s clothing. Number 9 at top of the mountain on the runaround track. And the then end of the track at top of the mountain, July 18th, 2015. Now, they have extended down the mountain, and we're going to show a few pictures of that, but let me confess to you, this show I found was too long, so I stopped updating it to show this extension to a point, so I apologize. On August 8th, 2020, the WWNF ran their first excursion to Milepost 8. Literally, Milepost 8. And the Howe Truss Bridge over Trout Brook at that time. It had not yet been inspected and passed for public use. So while we were allowed to walk on it, we could not take the train across it. And a quarter mile to go to Route 218 at head tide. And there's the 52 cross the bridge and standing there. Here's the embankment below the head tide church. And this is where the derailment occurred, well, just north of here, where the head tide water tower was. And they have recreated the head tide water tank, although they've put it in Alna and Prebles. Now, for many years, this was considered the smallest station ever built. There was a space inside for an agent, and there was like two-seat waiting room. The WWNF built it for a display at the Maine State Fair, and it stayed there for a number of years, and then the fair was changing things. So since it was designed to be portable, they moved it back to Alna Center. It was stood in the yard for a while. Currently, it's up at the head of the mountain as, well, I think basically just to get it out of the way. The WWNF Weeks Mills Freight House. It's in a cow pasture. And the recreated Weeks Mills Freight House in Alna. This is where the gift shop, you buy your tickets, wonderful selection of books, souvenirs. The base of the Weeks Mill enclosed water tank. After the water tank had been removed, the local farmer turned it into a garage. And Palermo Station, Albion Station. This thing was derelict. A terrible storm was coming. Two guys from the local historical society went down with some chains and cables and cabled it down. They saved the building. They then started to reconstruct it. There was a whole project at the Albion Station being done by the local historical society. We'll now return to Weeks Mills and follow the former branch to Winslow. Here's the East Vassalboro Station. The porch that you see in that building is sticking out into where the tracks used to be. This is the rebuilt North Vassalboro. Again, the half porch coming out in the track side. This one, they put a L up on the second floor. And we're going back to Alna. Hand-powered trips are available there. And George McAvoy. He was a railroad enthusiast who grew up in Grafton, Massachusetts. He learned that the Maine Central Station in Freeport, Maine was for sale during 1963. After purchasing Freeport, he was gifted the Thorndike Station building by the Belfast and Moosehead Lake Railroad. During 1964, a large plot of land was purchased along Route 27 in Boothbay, Maine. And by early 1960s, almost all of the 2-foot gauge narrow Maine. Oh God, let me start that again. By the early 1960s, almost all of the 2-foot gauge native Maine narrow gauge equipment was spoken for by Edaville. A fleet of German-built locomotives were brought to the site in the summer of 1965. The museum first opened to the public on Memorial Day, 1965. Boothbay established a locomotive shop, which has become a regional resource. Here's Boothbay number 6, the Stettin, classic German 040. Boothbay number 7, again a German 040, but it's burning damp coal. Boothbay number 3, a Plymouth. Boothbay's chief mechanical officer was rooting through a junkyard one day and he found parts. He bought the parts, took them to Boothbay, and reassembled this locomotive. No idea its original history. And here's the recreated WWF Coach 5. It's very short. It was originally used on a line in New Hampshire. Franklin and Megantic Deluxe Coach 2. Bridgeton and Saco River 11, built as a baggage mail combine. Edaville turned it into a full coach in a couple of changes. Boothbay is thinking of rebuilding it as a baggage mail combine. And a recreated Sandy River and Rangley Lake excursion car. And Edaville Caboose 551. It's along the lines of a Sandy River and Rangley Lake caboose, but it was built at Edaville. It's not the Sandy River and Rangley Lake 551. Bridgeton and Saco River Boxcar 51 re-entered service during 2018 at Boothbay. It comes out when they have a festival day. The former Main Central Freeport Station, which started it all. And number 6 arriving at Thorndike. The Summit Freight Train at Boothbay. There's a number of very nice, they're not in the greatest shape, but some very interesting pieces of freight equipment on display there. And number 6 coming out of the covered bridge and passing the Main Central South Gardner section car shed. Here's number 6 Stettin and train. And if it wasn't for that fountain, this would be a perfect place to get a reflection of the entire train in that pond. And motor car 4, the second section to the train we just saw previously. And the third section, motor car number 2. Number 7 and train by the pond. The Boothbay Restoration Shop. Very important facility for locomotive boilers throughout the New England area. Sorry if I'm running a little long, but there's a lot of stuff to cover. Boothbay's Restoration Shop has become an FRA certified small boiler shop, making an important resource for Northern New England Preservation Railways. SD Warren number 2 during a 2018 outing prior to completion of the restoration. You see the gentleman there behind sitting in the cab, the engineer. He doesn't have a seat. He's got a one of those 5-gallon plastic buckets that he's sitting on. And the race is on. Well, it was sort of a race for a few moments, but christening the SD Warren 2 with Moxie soda. Well, what else would you use for a main 2-footer? September 8th, 2018. And that's George McAvoy pouring the soda on the coupler. SD Warren 2 on the day it went back into service. And Bard Edaville number 3 at the Boothbay shop. On March 15th, 1880, George E. Mansfield, remember we left him a long time ago, resigned his position with the Sandy River Railroad. Mansfield accepted an invitation of the citizens of Bridgeton to help them build a railroad. The Bridgeton and Saco River Railroad, a state charter, was granted on July 19th, 1981 to the Bridgeton and Saco River. The line between Hiram Junction, renamed Bridgeton Junction in 1898, and the Portland and Ogdensburg, later the Main Central, and Bridgeton was opened on January 29th, 1883. The Bridgeton and Saco River was extended 4.9 miles from Bridgeton to Harrison as of August 3rd, 1898. On July 24th, 1912, the Main Central Railroad acquired ownership and control of the Bridgeton and Saco River. But like the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes, it kept it a separate organization. Here's Bridgeton and Saco Railroad number 1 in Bridgeton. This is now the site of the local high school. Number 6 in a train in Harrison. And remember number 11, that baggage mail combine? There it is in the end of the train. The beginning of the end for the Bridgeton and Saco River. On October 1st, 1927, the Bridgeton and Saco River went into receivership, ending Maine Central control. The line was sold at auction on June 1st, 1930 to the locally owned Bridgeton and Harrison Railroad. The Bridgeton and Harrison abandoned the Bridgeton to Harrison trackage on October 1st, 1930. Well, yes, they abandoned it, but the reason they abandoned it is the trackage was so bad that it could not be operated on, and they didn't have the money to repair it. And here's motor bus number 3 at Harrison. The line came to the attention of rail enthusiasts during the 1930s as the last passenger-carrying 2-foot gauge railroad. And it carried a lot of people, a lot of enthusiasts, special trains out of Boston and all that. On October 9th, 1939, the Bridgeton Town Board asked the management to buy out their stock holdings. At a sale on December 8th, 1939, the only bid was from a scrap dealer. The line shut down during September 1941. The local Bridgeton Museum has the headlights from the 5 and the 7. Now, the 7's a little uncomfortable because the 7 is still in existence and is sitting in Alna Center, owned by the Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad and Museum. And here's the Bridgeton and Harrison General Office sign. I call your attention to the superintendent, E.T. Meade. Edgar T. Meade. Yes, that's that guy in the early 1950s who wrote all those railroad books. Little short pamphlet-sized railroad books, but he basically was one of the early authors in the model railroad, or rather railroad enthusiast genre. The Winton Machine Works, located in South Northbridge, Massachusetts. They manufactured machinery for the textile industry and was established during 1831. During 1902, they built a 2-foot electrified interplant railroad, which was dieselized in the 1949-1950 period. 2-foot railway operations ended in 1967. The surviving equipment was sold off. Ellis D. Atwood operated a cranberry bog in South Carver, Massachusetts, part of the Ocean Spray Group. The cranberry bog utilized a 2-foot gauge industrial line to distribute supplies. A railway enthusiast, Atwood began to acquire 2-foot gauge equipment from Maine. One of the first tourist railway operations, the Eddyville Railroad, opened during 1947. Atwood passed away on November 30th, 1950, due to injuries from a home accident. Atwood was assisted by Linwood Moody, a former Maine narrow gauge line worker who would write a book on the subject. Atwood was also assisted by Fred Richardson, who would bring F. Nelson Blunt into Eddyville. Blunt would later create Steamtown with Richardson. The Eddyville Railroad was located in South Carver, Massachusetts. It was a 5.4-mile loop around cranberry bogs. Atwood's widow, Althea, and nephew, Dave Eldridge, operated Eddyville until 1957. F. Nelson Blunt purchased the leasehold, operating it from 1957 until 1970. The leasehold passed to others, with operations continuing until 1990. Number 8 at Eddyville, with a passenger train. This is Bridgeton and Harrison, number 8. Bridgeton and Harrison, number 7, with a freight train at Eddyville. Notice Eddyville was not into preservation because they had no problem relettering all the equipment. Eddyville became more about children than trains. Eddyville acquired a lot of the B&H freight cars. Many were scrapped for parts to build other cars. The Eddyville Railroad was shut down after the end of the 1991 season. Parts of the property were sold for redevelopment as housing. Most of the rolling stock was sold at auction in September 1993. Part of Eddyville would reopen in 1999, devoted to Thomas the Tank Engine. The Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad and Museum acquired most of the rolling stock used at Eddyville at an auction in September 1993. Leased a part of the former Portland Corporation Works in Portland as a museum site. Began operations in 1994 over a 1.5 mile long former Grand Trunk Railway branch along the shore of Casco Bay in Portland. And here's the former locomotive erecting shed of the Portland Company. It's still there today. Diesel electric number 1, which came from the Whitten Machine Works. Monson 3 on the Casco Bay shore. Number 11, the backup motive power. Passenger cars really loomed over this thing. Rangley, pride of the Sandy River and Rangley Lakes. This was a parlor car. And here's the interior of the Rangley. Sandy River and Rangley Lakes 15. And just to confuse things, they also had Bridgeton and Saco Railroad 15 coach, the Pondicherry. Eddyville, number 22. Again, this is one of the cars built by Eddyville to classic narrow gauge designs. Eddyville, number 102. This was, sort of a recreation of the Sandy River and Rangley Lake excursion cars. Sandy River and Rangley Lake Motor 4 in Portland. This thing gets trucked everywhere. Bridgeton and Saco River Boxcar 56 in Portland. Bridgeton and Saco River caboose number 32. And Eddyville 12 has become Sandy River and Rangley Lakes 553. Bridgeton and Saco River 2, a wedge snowplow that has seen better days. Let's take a ride along Casco Bay. By the way, it's kind of nice. This is Hancock Street, the end of track. The building you see over here to right, the 3-story brick, that was originally an office building owned by the Grand Trunk Railroad, and to its right was the train shed and station of the Grand Trunk Railroad. They're gone, but the office building remains. Here's Bridgeton and Saco River 7, was restored to operation in Portland, Maine in May 2018. It's seen here taking water. The number 1 in the passenger train in summer. The number 3 in the passenger train in winter. And number 7 at the crossing near the shops in Portland. And number 11 at the Cutter Road grade crossing. Monson 3 backing onto its train at the outer end of the line. And here's number 3 at the outer end of the line. It's interesting, when they run a steam locomotive, the steam locomotive gets to run around the train. When they run a diesel, they basically put a qualified man on the rear and back to Portland. Here's the Sandy River and Rangley Lakes 553 at the end of the line. It's being run by a diesel today, so notice there's a set of horns and a headlight on the caboose. And here's number 1 at the end of the line. It's same day, the other end of the train. The Grand Trunk Swing Bridge has been left open since the 1984 fire. And if any of you have B&B Beans, this was their original factory over here. Portland is losing the museum. The original 10-year lease expired in 1994. There have been 2 one-year leases since then. A former interurban right-of-way in Gray, Maine has been acquired. The possible sign of the future in Gray. And Bridgeton and Saco River 14, one of 2 tank cars on the narrow gauge. And Bridgeton and Saco River Flanger 40. This was the only double truck flanger on the main narrow gauge lines. Okay, before I describe this, here's what happened. The property in Gray could not get permission to build track on the former interurban right-of-way. It had been deemed a federal wetland, even though it had once been tracked. So that wasn't going to happen. The Maine Narrow Gauge Railway quickly arranged for some of their equipment to be moved to the WW&F in Alna. Some other equipment has been put in a warehouse And this pinkish blue building right near the ferry in Portland has been acquired to use as a new quarters. And they run a shuttle train from here to the Casco Bay drawbridge using a diesel locomotive. And here we are in Allen, Maine. Here's Bridgeton and Saco River 8 at the Allen turntable. It's not operational at the moment. Monson 4 at Allen, it's also not operational, but it makes for a great exhibit. Sandy River and Wrangley Lakes 14 in Allen, Maine. There was one 3-foot gauge line in the state of Maine. Yeah, we always associate 2-foot gauge with Maine. So here we go. The Rockport Railroad. This was the 3-foot gauge line laid out by the Rockport line manufacturers, Carlton Norwood Company and Shepherd Company in 1886. It ran 3 miles from Simonton's Corner to the kilns at the Rockport waterfront. The railroad had 2 Vulcan 040T locomotives and 35 5-ton cars built by the Knowlton brothers in Camden. And here's a picture of the Rockport Railroad feeding the lime kilns down at the harbor in Camden. In Rockport, rather. The line operated for 14 years, after which it was sold to the Rockport Lime Company. The quarry eventually flooded, and it's now the centerpiece of the Simonton Corner State Park. A memorial to the line exists at the harbor in Rockport. And these lime kilns still stand in Rockport. This is what the narrow gauge train was dumping into earlier. And nearby is this steam locomotive. Nice little 3-foot gauge Vulcan, right? Well, yeah. It's an 04 steam saddle tank locomotive with 30-inch diameter diners and 9 by 14-inch cylinders, built by the Vulcan Locomotive Works in Wilkes-Barre, serial number 3380 in September 1923. However, it was built as Queens Subway Apartment and Loft Building Corporation 3. We want to discuss Long Island Industrial Railway history. We've already been an hour and a half into this, so let's not go that far. People ask me, with the trains, tracks, and buildings gone, and 80 years of Mother Nature reshaping the land, how can I tell why I'm in the area of the main 2-foot gauge lines? Look for the signs of the 2-foot gauge country. Notice particularly the sign on the right. It was taken a few years ago based on the gas price, but look what they got for sale in this general store. And I will confirm all of those products are there. So our story began in North Wales and it will end there. Brecon Mountain Railway in Wales has constructed a replica of Sandy River and Wrangley Lake Caboose's 556 to 558 designated Car E. Under construction are recreations of Sandy River and Wrangley Lakes 23, a 262, and Sandy River and Wrangley Lakes 10, a Forney Design 244T. By the way, the line also has a 2-foot gauge 462, and it's worth your time to visit. And some suggestions to your library. If I could only get one, I'd opt for the Crittenton book. But Linwood Moody has a sort of a folksy down home, and I used to work for them attitude. And thank you for your attendance and attention. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome. Are there any questions, comments, or constructive criticisms? And I'm going to turn the show off after the legal stuff and answer your questions. In our next segment, the idea of a narrow gauge railway goes west and gets a foot added to it. Please consider joining us. Okay, folks, I haven't bored you to death. I hope I haven't bored you all to death. Are there any questions? Please
I
unmute
actually found this
yourself and ask.
interesting. My brother-in-law lives in Damariscotta.
Ooh.
And Wiscasset is a location I passed through several times, and I've seen those pilings, but never knew that was the trestle for the railroad there.
Hey,
and he also
you make a left-hand turn, go 5 miles, and you can find the the WWNF recreated.
Yeah, and there's I saw the sheds, were the sheds that you showed the museum itself up there off that I think it's 27 maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, he took me up there one time, and he actually volunteered at that railroad for a bit, and he's now working with the Cumberland Knox, which is a fairly new short line that's taken over a portion of the line up there between Brunswick and Rockland, I think it is. He maintains signals up there right now, but it was interesting to me just to see some of the slides, and I could recognize some of the buildings that you were showing.
Okay, I'm
Since
glad I was
I've
able
been
to
there and
do
seen
that.
them.
Yeah, and I put them back into order so they kind of make sense, I guess. But it's, you know what, you start delving into it and you get deeper and deeper. I mean, I could do another 20 minutes with snow scenes on WWNF
Yeah.
and their recreation. They're currently building another coach using, again, 18 circa 1890 plans. When they operate their trains, they handbrakes, whistle signals, hand signals. It, you know, they're very much into the genre of the early 20th century pre-safety appliance era on the narrow gauge railways.
Mhm.
And you got to check that they don't operate every weekend. What you got to do is Google their website, see when they're operating, and you know, try to string it together so you can get 2 or 3 of them at the same time. Or
Is
when they're having a narrow gauge convention, go up there for a festival.
the last time I was up there in a process, they just built a large shed up there, as I
Yeah.
recollect, and I know they were working on a locomotive, but it was interesting. It was an interesting visit, I can say that, and they were very cordial to me.
Yes.
Me being a Yankee, they would talk to me, but
Yeah.
I had a ton of questions, and it's just some of the things that they could relate to me. And I wish I would have had more time to spend there, because it was definitely an interesting visit.
Well, you know, it ended up I got myself a membership at the WWNF, and while I usually only visit it once a year or something, the newsletters certainly keep me connected with the genre.
Mhm.
You know, good stuff, and you know they've got, let's see, they've got the number 9, no, excuse me, the number 10. They're rebuilding the boiler, and then they are building using Sandy River and Wrangley Lakes large Forney plans. They're building a large Forney. So in another 5 years, they'll have 3 locomotives they're running. And then it won't surprise me if they decide to tackle a 262.
Okay.
They've got a turntable now, and they've added a roundhouse. It's
A lot
as
of
someone
dedicated volunteers there, I can say that.
as someone once explained to me, we're lucky, we're well endowed, we've got the money. It's just because we're so far away from everything, we don't have the volunteers to do everything we want to.
Mhm.
And
Anyone
it's,
else have any comments, questions?
No. Thank you very much, Ed.
you're welcome. Thank you, Jane. And George Pete, thank you for sticking in and hanging in with me. I
Yeah,
hope,
we enjoyed it.
thank you. I hope I wasn't too long or I spent too much time on anything, but
Yeah.
you know, I think probably I got to cut this into 2 parts, but you know what? It's like, how do you cut your baby into 2 parts?